So I am a history teacher at John F. Ross. I've been working at John F. Ross since 2007, and I've been working in the Upper Grand District School Board since 2004. I'm here tonight because I really love teaching history, and as a history teacher, we're always challenged with how do we get young people to love history as much as we do. I think I came by my love of history from the cradle. My grandfather and grandmothers were all big history buffs. My dad was a huge history buff, and I've always loved stories, and I've just loved imagining the past and what a previous period of time looked like. And so for me, I wanted to share that with students and young people to get them excited about the past, but also to see that therein lies lessons for all of us that we can use and apply to our lives today. So our story kind of begins in 2008 when it was the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War. And I was sort of not sleeping, laying in my bed, reading articles on my phone, and I came across this news story about a group of college students in Peterborough that had a postcard show up in their mailbox, and it was about a person that used to live in their house who fought in the 60th Battalion. And so reading more in the article, it turns out that there was an author in Pickering who had written a book about the First World War, and his grandfather had served in the 60th Battalion. And so to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the armistice, he was sending postcards to the former residences of the 60th Battalion, just letting the people who lived in those houses know that a soldier used to live there. And so reading that article, I thought, you know what? We can totally do this in Guelph. We have so many of our old homes preserved, and we have a community that knows that there's a rich military history, and would be very interested in learning that that rich military history is also captured in the brick and mortar of their houses. So I got to school the next morning, and I ran down to my principal's office, and I said, "Do you have a minute? I have a brilliant idea." And so she kind of looked at me, raised an eyebrow, and said, That's pretty big to suggest that your idea is brilliant. And I'm like, oh, you just wait. You just wait. So we sat down and I said, it's Remembrance Week. We're going to send a postcard to every former residence of Guelph's World War I soldiers that are on the cenotaph. And she said, that is a brilliant idea. So she's like, I've got you. She's like, whatever you need, you can count on me and I will do that. So we had 2 of the 3 ingredients that we need in order to make something really, really come alive in the education system. We have a great idea. We have somebody who's willing to put support behind it. And all we needed was the students. We just needed the kids to be as excited about this as we were. So that year I had 2 grade 10 history classes. I had them back to back in the afternoon. I think I had the second smallest room in the school, but with the most students crammed inside. And man, oh man, was that a hot, sweaty classroom full of very energetic grade 10s who were just ready to get out of there and get home because it was the end of the school day. And I show up with a list of all the names on the Guelph Cenotaph. And I'm like, hey kids, we're going to research who these people were, and we're going to find out where they used to live. And we're going to send postcards to their house. And so my students were like, they weren't sure. They thought that was going to be really hard. And they thought, how do we know where they lived? And like, we are going to figure it out. So we started with the Library and Archives of Canada, and we began going by name. Each student picked a name, and we started to look up their attestation papers on the Library and Archives website. And so in the attestation paper, it has the name of the soldier, it has their address, their next of kin, what their job was, and we just began exploring that attestation paper. And one of the first things my students did, and I didn't even have to ask them to do it, they just wanted to know, well, where did they live? And they went to Google Earth and they started typing in the addresses. And they started to realize, wait a second, I know that house. I've seen it before. I walked by that house on the way to school. And then they started to go to the next page of the attestation paper where it shared how old our soldier was when he enlisted, and it shows his hair color and his eye color, and his religion, and if he had any scars or if he had any tattoos. And there's one guy who's really, really tatted up. That was quite entertaining to my students. And all of a sudden, that soldier became real. Now, my idea was we're just going to send a postcard, so all we need is the address and just some basic information about who they are. We're going to let them know, like, when he was born and who he enlisted with, and that's about it. That's all the space that a postcard will allow. But on the Library and Archives website, there's a link, and my students, they're really good at clicking on links, and so they click on this link to the digitized service file, and a whole other world opens up in front of them. They can now see that what ship he sailed on from Halifax or Montreal over to England. He can see where the training camp was that our soldier participated in. We get the medical records. We know, oh my gosh, he was wounded. He had a shrapnel wound in 1915. He had a gunshot wound in 1916. We can see that he had trench foot. We can see that he had trench fever, although it's not called trench fever. It's called something else in the medical file. But all of a sudden, we got a really rich understanding of this person's life. And I realized, oh, this is more than a postcard. Forget about the postcard. We are not going to send a bunch of postcards this week. We're going to actually write essays. Each student is going to pick a soldier, and they're going to write a one-page essay. So these were my goals. This is what I started out with. This is what I thought, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to get them to do some historical research, and they're going to write biographical essays. And the students, they're going to learn how to organize that research. And the students are going to, be able to reflect and look at the effect of a specific event on our soldier's life, right? Really teachery things. But as we got deeper into the documents, and as we begin to uncover the things that happened to our soldier, the conversations began to shift. And we talked far more about ethics and philosophy. We talked about whether or not the value of a human life has changed in the last 100 years. When we're looking at a soldier who has a shrapnel wound and then a week later is taken back on strength and is with his battalion, right? Is he fully healed? Is he ready to go back into those trenches? And at the same time, there's curiosity developing about, well, where are these battles that our soldiers are fighting in? So we go over to the war diaries of the battalions that our soldiers are serving in, and we look up the date that they were killed in action or wounded in action according to their digitized service file. And so now we're trying to reconstruct that moment. And so we're doing some secondary source research. And we're going outside the canon of Canadian history, where our textbooks look at the Second Battle of Ypres and the Battle of the Somme and Vimy Ridge and Passchendaele. And we're seeing a lot of our Guelph soldiers on our cenotaph are fighting at Saint Eloi, are killed at Mount Sorrel, at Hill 70. And so we're learning about battles that we wouldn't normally learn about in our course of study. And we're seeing an image of warfare that we don't normally get to see in our textbooks. One of my soldiers, his soldier he was studying was killed on August 12th, 1918, during the last 100-day campaign. And when we opened up the war diary of the 13th Battalion, it described 10 hours of hand-to-hand combat. Right? The nature of war started to shift in the minds of my students as well. And then we had these conversations around, well, what do we share? We found all this stuff, but what would this man want us to share? We're going to send this out to a stranger's home, and so we need to treat his information with care. There's going to be things in his medical file that he probably wouldn't want his mother to know. He really does not want his wife to know. So should we be putting that into an essay and mailing it out? So we had these really rich and responsible conversations that took us far beyond these very teachery learning goals that I had set out. So in the end, this is what we get. we get a one-page essay. We did 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph is the life of the soldier before he went to war. The second paragraph is his life at war. And the third paragraph is what the war did to Canada. How did it transform the country? So we used primary and secondary source research. We relied heavily on the attestation papers and the digitized service files from the Library and Archives of Canada. We also relied heavily on the war diaries. But we also began to consult with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and with the Canadian Virtual War Memorial, which often had newspaper clips and photographs, which help give a richer sense of our soldiers' life. And then we mailed these out to the former homes of our students, the former homes of our soldiers, to the residents that live there today. So the Legion helped us out by hooking us up with some nice poppy stickers, because I was concerned if we mail things out handwritten that say, "Dear occupant," people aren't going to open it. So the Legion helped us, and they got us some poppy stickers that we could put on the envelope. Our Comtech class designed a return address label with a poppy on it so that they knew it was coming back to the school, anybody who wanted to write back to us. And we did get lots of people writing back to us. And we sent these out to the community. And we did this for 5 years until we had mailed a letter out for every single soldier from the First World War on Guelph Cenotaph. So today I've brought 2 guests with me, 2 of the students that I'm teaching right now in my class. I have Cassie and Violet, and they're going to read their soldier essay. So you can kind of get an idea of what the kids were producing and the quality of the research that they were doing. So Violet, we're going to start with you. So if you want to come on up. So Violet did research on Sergeant Vincent Bowen, who was in the 18th Battalion.
Vincent Bowman was 22 years old when he enlisted for military service on October 26, 1914. He was born in Worcestershire, England, to his mother, Annie Elizabeth Chell, age 22, and his father and next of kin, William Bowman, age 20. The family immigrated to Wellington, Ontario in 1911, where he worked as a carpet weaver. He married Hilda Perkin on January 2, 1915. Bowman had a dark complexion, blue eyes, brown hair, and stood at 5 feet 4 inches. No one can truly be prepared for the harsh and challenging conditions of life in a war. For Vincent Bowman, his story began with preparation for the war between December 1914 and May 1915. He left Canada and sailed to England aboard the RMS Grampian, where he began training with the 18th Battalion. During the war, Bowman suffered from trench fever and trench foot. He eventually healed after spending 139 days in the hospital. Bowman continued to fight in the 18th Battalion and was eventually promoted to corporal on August 8th, the day before being promoted to sergeant on August 9th, 1918. The 18th Battalion desperately required an acting sergeant. However, as per protocol, Bowman had to be promoted to corporal first before he was able to attain the role of a sergeant. Bowman died in the Second Battle of Arras, also known as the Battle of Amiens, pardon my pronunciation, on August 26, 1918. The Second Battle of Arras was part of Canada's 100 Days and was fought in the Arras region of France. This battle involved British, Canadian, and Australian troops fighting against the German forces. The battle was part of a large plan to relieve pressure on the French army in the Battle of N, which is the French pronunciation. It involved a series of attacks with both sides attempting to gain control. Despite horrific battle conditions, the Allied forces made significant gains. Canadian troops advanced 130 kilometers and captured 3,300 prisoners of war. According to his military service file, Bowman was killed in action in front of Arras. He was hit in the stomach and killed instantly by an enemy rifle bullet. This was a day of sorrow for the battalion, as 30 other ranks were also killed in action. From enduring hospitalization due to various illnesses to his tragic death, Bowman's life in the war highlights the sacrifices made by those who served. The challenging and unpredictable conditions of serving and surviving the war were captured in Vincent Bowman's journey. He is one of millions of soldiers who exemplify and remind us of soldiers' bravery and honor during horrific war times. From enlisting in the war in Canada to Bowman's final moments at the Second Battle of Arras, he overcame several near-fatal illnesses and received recognition and promotion for his heroism and commitment. The wartime experiences of Vincent Bowman are a testament to his honor and personal sacrifice. Bowman's bravery and perseverance in the face of multiple obstacles and near-death experiences ultimately resulted in his promotion as corporal and recognition for his service in the First World War.
And so we're going to have Cassie come up. And Cassie's, she has the only woman on the cenotaph, a nurse, Alice. Yeah, coming up. So Alice Truesdale was recently added within the last few years to the cenotaph. Right? 2018, yeah.
All right. First of all, thanks for having me. Yay. Okay. Okay. Whew. Alice Louise Truesdale was a nursing sister who served in the Canadian Army Medical Corps during the First World War. She was born on December 12, 1892, and died on September 12, 1918, due to illness. She was a Baptist, and she was born in Waterford, Ontario, and her next of kin is her mother, Miss W.H. Truesdale. When the war first broke out and the Canadian military needed to recruit medical personnel, Canadian military nurses were required to be trained nurses before enlistment. This limited the number of semi-trained and untrained women who, in the past, had offered a form of nursing service to other armies. Alice was a young nurse straight out of medical school when she enlisted. Having met the requirements for enlistment, she would be going off to work in some of the worst conditions in the war, the field hospitals. In these hospitals, doctors and nurses would have been treating injuries like gunshot wounds, sprains, broken bones, missing limbs, burns, and many more physical injuries. Doctors and nurses also treated different illnesses such as trench fever, pneumonia, meningitis, dysentery, and at the time Alice was serving, the Spanish influenza. They did this while getting shot at and covered in mud. Many of the nurses likely shared similar experiences while treating patients. According to a book titled Unknown Warriors by K.E. Luard, published in 1930, a nurse serving in Queen Alexandra's Imperial Nursing Service Reserve wrote about her experiences treating patients in a diary. She wrote, "Captain D is a scrap better today, able to emerge from bromides and talk a little. He told me that when they were holding the Hohenzollern trenches in the worst weather, when they stood waist high in liquid mud, 2 of his men slipped under it, went asleep, and their bodies were dug out the next day." On the Canadian Great War Project website, it states that Alice Truesdale died of illness. Her circumstances of death register states she died of infantile paralysis, which is commonly known as polio. When people think of the accomplishments of the people involved in World War I, we think of the soldiers who gave their lives for the safety of the people and the people in power who planned the campaigns that led to the Allies' victory. Rarely do we think of the contributions of the people in the Canadian Army Military Corps and the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Nursing Service Reserve, like Alice Louise Truesdale, who without the help of them, we would not have the peaceful world we have today. Okay, thanks for having me again.
So some pretty impressive research. Right? They're going through primary source documents and they're looking for words and lines and piecing it together into a narrative, into a story. Now, we had a lot of help along the way because these service files are written with some nuanced language and some coded language. They don't necessarily come out and state explicitly what's going on, right? In the case of some of our soldiers, it might indicate that they were killed in action. And when we go into the war diary, we get a more detailed and robust explanation as to exactly how they were killed in action. So we had to elicit a lot of help help from the community. And so Ken Irvin, who's here in the back, was really wonderful. He came into my class and helped us read the documents. We were uncovering patterns. So as we're trying to piece together the story, we're noticing some patterns and some trends that we weren't really understanding. One of the things we observed was some 17 and 18-year-olds were dying of heart failure. So to my students who were 15 and 16, this seems really unusual. Why would a 17 or an 18-year-old die of heart failure? So when Ken came in to speak to the class, one of the things that he talked about was, that's probably an indication of Spanish influenza. Right? They're not going to write Spanish influenza into the record because they don't want to create panic. But a 17 or 18-year-old whose heart just stops has Spanish influenza. We also noticed that their next of kin was often their mother. Even if their father was still alive, they often chose their mother as next of kin. In the case where women were widowed or their husbands were overseas, we saw that the wives were moving. So there was always a note updating their address. So, Ken can explain to my students, well, most people rented back then. There wasn't as much home ownership. And then one of the things that was happening while men were away is that there was inflation and cost of living was going up, but rents were also being increased, right? When we look at how genders were separated into public sphere and private sphere, male sphere, female sphere, women weren't the ones who were typically negotiating the rent. And so when their husbands were away or their sons were away and they were widowed, they were not in a position to negotiate those rents. And so rents were often being increased. And so we saw women on the move. In one record, we saw actually the mother moved in to the Baptist church for a period of a few months. So she must have been without home at that point in time. We also came across home children. There's a few home children on our cenotaph. These were children that were brought to Canada mostly by the Bernardo home because they were orphans or because they were being raised in poverty. One of the home children really tugged at our heartstrings. His name is Cecil Holland. Cecil, his records are incomplete, so we were really struggling to piece together what happened to Cecil Holland. You see, Cecil Holland enlisted when he was 17, but he got caught. So a few months later, Cecil Holland enlisted again and miraculously was 18 years old. His next of kin was the Bernardo home for orphaned boys. Now, before Cecil ships out, his appendix bursts and he has to have surgery at Guelph General Hospital and he passes away. He's buried in Woodlawn Cemetery. 2 brothers are listed on his tombstone, but no relatives are listed anywhere in his war documents other than on his death registry where someone has handwritten Alfred Holland Esquire, Horsham. So we're trying to track him down. So we reach out to the Museum and Archives of Horsham, England, and I reach out to Ken. I said, how do we find out about our home children? And so Ken, he did some digging for me and connected us with the museum and archivist at the Dufferin County Museum, who was able to uncover that young Cecil came to Canada when he was 12. He came by himself. None of his siblings seemed to have come to Canada. He started in a farm in Palmerston, Ontario, and then was moved to a farm near Forks of the Credit. We found a news article when he died that was published in the newspaper in Erin, Ontario, that describes him as a really well-liked, well-respected young man. And then in Horsham, they were able to locate his family. We weren't able to get the names of all his siblings and find out if his victory medal, which he would have received, ever made it to them. But we were able to find out that he was surrendered by his mother to a workhouse when he was only 3 years old, that his father was an alcoholic and struggled to provide adequate financial support to the family. And so she was unable to look after all of her children. And so they were put in the workhouse, and then Cecil made his way to Canada as a home child. Right? These are the kinds of stories that we're finding in our cenotaph that are just tucked behind a name. And my students made really deep connections to those people. Right? They learned about the battles but they also learned about the people that were part of the building of this city, that made contributions, and their families contributed to what we have today in Guelph. So we gained a new perspective and appreciation for the past that came before us and how that has helped make the city that we have today. Okay. Right. So we finished mailing out the letters to all of the residents in Guelph that we could find addresses for. Some of the addresses that our soldiers lived in don't exist anymore. There's a number of soldiers that lived on York Road, on the side of the street that's now a park. So we did our best, and we sent the addresses across the street to the people on the other side, letting them know that there used to be houses across the road from you, and in one of them there was a soldier. We did send a letter to an LCBO because there used to be a house there that one of our soldiers had lived in. So we did our best to try to get as many letters out there into the community. So now we're working on the cenotaph at Rockwood. So a number of my students are researching the names from the Rockwood cenotaph. And we are going over some of the ones that we did in Guelph. And our goal now is to try to create public access to this information. So we are got grand plans to create maybe a map. I've been looking at some old maps of the city of Guelph. This one is from around 1910. And maybe we can try to find where they lived on this map and then create a link. And so people could come and click on a poppy icon and open up a story of a soldier. And we can see where our soldiers were located in our city during the First World War. So that's where I would like to go with this. But overall, I've just been so moved by my students and how much they came to care about their soldier. One of my students was fortunate enough to go to France one summer with her aunt, and she asked her aunt, "Can we go to Vimy Ridge?" And so her aunt said, "Yes, of course." And when they got to Vimy, she explained that in my history class, I researched a man named William Pelton. And William Pelton was killed in action, and his body was never found. So his name is on the Vimy Memorial. His name is listed at Pas de Calais. There is no tombstone for him. And she's like, "I want to go see him because I don't know if anyone in his family ever has." And so one of the best parts about this for me as the teacher is what my students have taken away to understand as the significance of the cenotaph, right? It's a structure in our downtown that many of them will pass by every single day and maybe not realize what it represents or what it signifies. But for a lot of Guelph's families, they left a son over in Europe, and they had nowhere to go when they went to grieve, and that cenotaph was their place. So today, for a lot of the people in our city, it's just names, and they don't know the stories behind the names. But thanks to my students, they do. So if you have any questions, I would love to answer them. Yes?
Have any of your students developed their own projects out of what they've done?
So I have a number of students that have done the same research using the same process, but for a member of their family. So I had a student that was doing that last week, getting ready for Easter, because he knew he was going to see his grandparents. So he wanted to show them his grandmother, her grandfather had fought in the First World War. So he was doing some research on his great-great-grandfather, I guess. I had a student who her family immigrated to Guelph from Italy, and her great-great-grandfather fought in the First World War, but for Italy. And so she was starting to look up this documentation for him through Italy's archives. And so she was reading them in Italian and getting some help from her grandmother wherever she was kind of stuck. And so they've been piecing together the lives of their relatives by following the same process that we've done in class, which has been really wonderful to see. Yeah.
So how did this project develop into the award you got?
So we've been doing this for 5 years. So I think there's about 216 names on the cenotaph, and we've been able to locate nearly everyone. There's one name on the cenotaph where we couldn't find records for. His last name is Baxter, and he's buried in Iraq, actually, and he fought with the British. So he enlisted. We know he enlisted right off the bat in 1914. So he probably has British citizenship. So he probably was very recent immigrant to Canada, and then went and probably has a military history with the British. We saw a few Guelph soldiers who were British immigrants that had served with Britain before go back to England and fight in the British Expeditionary Force. I imagine that's why he has ended up in Iraq, and it may be why we can't find anything. The Imperial War Museum in London was bombed during World War II, so their records, many of them have been lost. So we have a far more robust collection and complete collection in Canada than the British do. But other than that, we were able to write letters for all the other ones and send them out. So that took a long time, and we got all sorts of wonderful feedback from the community. We had people writing us back. We had a woman write us back. She was new to Guelph. They had moved here from Colombia. She had no idea that this was the history of her home. And so she contacted and said, teach me how to do this research. I want to learn more about the people that used to live in my house. We sent a letter to a home that's still in the same family. So it was the grandniece of our soldier. So she came right over to the school, and she was able to confirm a few things. He's one of our young men that died of heart failure at the age of 18. And so she said, yes, he died of Spanish flu. So we had a really, really great response from the community. And so my colleagues that I work with nominated the project for a Governor General's Teaching Excellence Award. The Governor General gives out 6 history awards every year. So I was the recipient, one of the recipients for 2023. Yeah. Yes, Ken?
Have you compiled all this research into any one spot?
Yeah, I do. I have a manuscript. So I have saved the essays, and I have compiled it into one spot. It's a little bit tricky because I had thought, oh, you know what, let's publish this. But the school board tells me that maybe I legally cannot because I've used the labor of minors to produce this information, and I have rewarded them with grades and not monetary payment.
I mean, it's not illegal if you don't get caught.
So well, we're going to try to do it the right way. So I do need to go back to the drawing board, which is what my kind of hopes are for the digital exhibit, and secure some permissions ahead of time, because this was sort of like, I didn't realize what we were getting until we got it. So while we were making it, you know, I was just thinking about what my students are learning and the skills, but then the product was incredible. Like, you heard 2 15-year-olds read to you their essays. Like, they don't sound like things that 15-year-olds normally write. That was really outstanding work. They poured themselves into it. I think we probably do about 3 or 4 like read-throughs and proofreads before we get to the final copy. Like, they work very hard on that. It matters to them. So once I saw how good the quality of the product was, and I realized this is such a treasure for our city, then I started to say, hey, how do we keep this and maybe publish it or donate it? And so the school board was like, well, that's a lot harder than you realize. So my hope, second round for the next 5 years, is to get all the permissions I need secured ahead of time. Because I also learned from the school board that I'm not allowed to contact students after they've graduated. And so a number of our students who started this have graduated. So
It's called
that's okay.
bureaucracy.
It is, yeah. That's okay. I've got lots of years left. We can keep going. Yeah.
Most learning is being book smart. This is not. This is real learning.
Mm-hmm.
How did you con the administrators to, like, they look, when you were just talking about what you said about some of the problems the administrators have with regard to it. The reality is there, but the administrators aren't too happy with it.
I did tell her it was brilliant, right? I led with, this is going to be brilliant.
This is awesome what you're
Yeah. Yeah.
and I'll go further. How'd you do it? How much time do you devote, because you're outside of the general curriculum, in my mind, and doing something really real, because what happens to when I see it's like a geometric progression is what you've done there, and you bring in philosophy, for instance, and so on, and students get starting to touch touchy issues like sex on the side and that kind of thing. Lots of that went on, of course. And how did you? It's amazing what you did. How you got the administration. How did that fit into the curriculum? Did they get a credit for that? Did you work full time with that in a
Yeah, so this is part of a semester. This they get a credit. We spend probably like
2 weeks on it.
so you spent 2 weeks kind of getting the research and then doing the writing. In terms with like my administration, you know, I want history to be an action, right? I treat it like a verb. You're doing something, right? I want that's the attraction to this. They're doing the research. I'm just sort of there to kind of help them understand it when they hit something that they don't understand, or if their documents are in cursive and they don't know what the letter is because it's kind of messy writing. You know, I'm just there for assistance.
Don't forget that the students you had doing this, they'll never forget it.
No, and they don't. And I hear that from graduates. Like, I still remember everything about my soldier, Miss Doupe, which is, for me, wonderful. In terms of my administration, like I when we started the project, I invited them in. She happened to pop in one day when the kids were asking, what does VDG mean? So it was a great time for your principal to show up when I say, oh, it means that soldier had gonorrhea. It's a great time for her to pop in. But that's the reality of war, and that's what these documents are showing. And these are some of the conversations we're having about, you know,
and it's killing.
What we share, what we don't share, and so, you know, for her, like, you know, she was thrilled with the whole idea of the project. She was pretty supportive from the beginning. You know, they like to see the kids getting involved in doing stuff. So this was a pretty active assignment. So I didn't have any issues with admin, but in terms of curriculum, it takes up a big amount of time. But I found that so many things connect to it. So, you know, when we're talking about women's history in my class, I bring back these attestation papers where the mother is next of kin, right? This is a way for her to receive some money if something happens to him. We go back and we revisit the fact that the women are moving. And so we can look at the precarious kind of nature of women's lives in the early part of the 20th century. So there's a lot that this project will lend to other parts of the course. When we look at the 1920s and Winnipeg General Strike and the challenges that Canadian public are bringing to government, right? Asserting their democratic rights and wanting a more responsive government. Well, that has a lot to do with the fact that they shed blood for 4 years in Europe, and they came back and they felt as though their government hadn't duly respected their sacrifice. They came back to unemployment. They came back to disease, and so I feel like the project is a good investment of time because so many things will connect later on, and we can see how this event, you know, really has a legacy in our history. Yes, Ken.
Were there any big surprises that came up? Any stories that you just went, oh my God, really?
Yeah, there was. We have a Swedish immigrant on our cenotaph, which I was really surprised. His name is Ernest Julin. So I was really surprised that we have someone from Sweden on our cenotaph. Most of our soldiers on the cenotaph were born in and around Guelph, where they were born in England. So to have a Swedish soldier on the cenotaph was quite interesting. He's also older. So he's a father of 4. And he's in his late 30s, early 40s when he enlists. And after he is killed in action, his wife moves to Cambridge, she moves to Galt, and she moves in with a sister, and they have a house fire, and the children perish. And when we came across his story, it was just like, how much more tragic can the lives of these people be? That, you know, you've thought you've gone through the worst that you could possibly go through. So it was very interesting because it was telling us a lot about the circumstances that people found themselves in and the upheaval that war brought to their lives. Yeah. Yes, Betty.
I saw the name Oakes come up on the screen
Yeah.
for Rockwood. The Oakes people, the Oakes family are still in Rockwood. They have some farms, I know, when I was living there.
Mm-hmm.
And so have you done any research on the Oakes that are actually in the Rockwood-Aramasa area?
Yeah, we haven't connected Wilford Oakes, but that's one of the things that I've been talking with some of my students from Rockwood. So this time around, we're looking specifically at the Rockwood cenotaph. There aren't nearly as many names on the Rockwood cenotaph, so I don't have a name from Rockwood for every student in my class. But one of the things we talked about, I'm like, some of these names, like I have taught students with these same surnames. So these families are still around. So that's one of the things that we were kind of talking about. And some of the kids I know have selected, that are from Rockwood, have selected a name from the Rockwood cenotaph because they know that family. Yeah. One of them, she lives on a street that's named after a soldier from Rockwood. So she didn't realize that her street was named after him. So she wanted to learn about him. So that's, I think, an interesting connection that we're maybe hoping to make. I think it's going to be a little bit more challenging connecting our Rockwood volunteers with a homestead because we don't necessarily have street addresses like we do in the city. So that might take a little bit more digging through some archives to figure out the lot and concessions and where they are now.
Yeah, the Oakes house is a red brick one on the 5th line.
Okay. Yeah, and this is also something that has come up too, is that there's names of places. Armstrong Mills. There's a soldier on our cenotaph from Armstrong Mills. He's a rather interesting fellow because he was part of a group of young men that lassoed the bust of Kaiser Wilhelm in the park in Kitchener and chucked it in a lake. And stole it out of the Concordia Club when the German residents of Berlin reclaimed it. So he's from a place called Armstrong Mills. So my students are like, where's Armstrong Mills? So we have names of places that would have been well known at the time that are more, they're not ghost towns, people still live there, but we don't call them those things anymore. So that was kind of interesting too. It was changing kind of the lay of the land or the geography of the area for our students. Yes.
At the beginning of the presentation, you were talking about how you're trying to really captivate the youth with how much history has to offer. Did you find that this project that you created has kind of captivated some of those students who aren't as inclined to history and learning about that? Yeah,
I think I've only had one student who was completely not into it. Everybody else really loved it. And so a lot of parent feedback I had was I didn't think my kid was a history kid, and then we did this project. And I think the beauty of it is that it's local. It's local history, so we're talking about people and places that might be familiar to them. When the students started looking up the houses of their soldiers, that I think is where I really got them. I really got them hooked once they went onto Google Earth and they were like, this house is really small, or this house is really close to my house, or I've seen this house, I walk by it on my way to school. I think it was making it relatable to the place where they live now that really got them interested in it. I think a lot of times when we're looking at history, we're talking about things that are geographically far away or far away in time from where we are right now. So it's hard to relate or hard to connect. And this made it very easy to connect. The kids had all seen the cenotaph. There's a house, 13 Aramasa, just down the street from John F. Ross, and 2 brothers served in the First World War, and they were both killed in action. And so that's, you know, a 5-10 minute walk away from the school. So for the students, it just made history real. These are real people. Their lives have had a real impact. I can see the imprint that they've left in the city that I live in now. Yeah.
Are the other teachers in your department involved in this project? Or is this
This became my thing. So when we started it, we were thinking initially about postcards. So I guess I was lucky because my history classes were in the afternoon. So the teachers that struck out in the morning, we had found a list of the names from the cenotaph that had been compiled by Ed Butts. He had made an article in 2014 for the 100th anniversary of the start of the First World War that was published in the Old Guelph Mercury. And so that was our starting point, so the kids could just pick a name. But the cenotaph has a lot of inaccuracies on it. So when they picked whose names will go in the cenotaph, they had a meeting and they invited people to share names that they thought should go in the cenotaph. And so because this is really the gravestone for a lot of those young men that are buried over in Europe, I think there was a lot of empathy for people that had moved to the city after the war. So their son was killed, but he didn't ever live in Guelph. So we have names on the cenotaph that we can't connect to any documents about Guelph. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't someone who lived here at some point that knew him. And so some of the names on there, you can't find supporting documentation for. Some of the names are misspelled. So what shows up in the service file doesn't match what's on the cenotaph. So the first classes that started doing it, they struck out a lot. They were looking up names and nothing was coming up. And so they were, getting frustrated, and the students were sort of no longer buying in. But I was after lunch. So I spent my whole lunch trying to troubleshoot this problem. And so when I brought it to my class after lunch, I had figured out which ones worked. I had figured out enough that worked that I could get my class started. And then we went from there. And since then, we have corrected the list. So we've gone through and we've typed in like several different versions of how you could spell this last name until we did find a record that was attached to Guelph. So we now have a fairly accurate list, which we've been able to get letters for. But it just ended up becoming like my little baby, and my students were super happy to do it. It was a lot of work, and so I'm very grateful that they didn't protest and say, no, we want to do something much easier than this, Miss Doupe. Because there's easier things that we can do, right? A test would have been much easier, but it would not have been as good for learning.
It was clearly successful because she's in your first period class.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Kevin? Kevin wants to speak to you.
Oh, okay.
Erin, on behalf of the Guelph Historical Society, I want to thank you very much. Congratulations again on your very deserving award.
Thank you.
This is a fascinating project. Clearly you connected with your students and with the folks in the room tonight. I want to thank you very much for that. Here's
wow.
something for you, and I believe something for each of the students here that have shared tonight. I want to thank you. It's free stuff. I want to thank you very much for sharing your work with us as well.
That poem at the front is in his.
Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.